Rediscovered: The Lost Arabic Diaries of the Harvard University Boston Museum of Fine Arts Expedition by Dr. Peter Dermanwellian from Harvard University.
Thanks very much, Courtney. Since time is short, I will dive right in.
Recording in progress.
So this talk is trying to open up a new window on specifically Egyptian contributions to the Western expeditions of the early 20th century. In this era where we're attempting to do social justice a little bit better, it's been difficult to give voices to the voiceless from the past. Metadata is often missing, photos aren't labeled, there are literacy or illiteracy problems, and we can fill a huge gap in this problem with the Arabic books that are the subject of this talk. So I'd like to give a brief history of the main archaeological players of one particular Qufti family, the Diraz family, that were responsible for this documentation, and then relate my account of the discovery of the Arabic diaries in Egypt and maybe give some examples of their significance. These books offer us a reassessment of the Egyptian role in what are usually described as Western excavations in Egypt. Just as a refresher, under George Reisner, first the Hearst expedition and then the Harvard MFA expedition worked more than 40 years at 23 different sites, all the ones that you see in red right here. And this is where it all started, with a young boy named Mahmoud Ahmed Sayed Diraz, more simply known as Sayed Ahmed or Sayed Ahmed Sayed, a young Qufti from the village of el-Qal. And whatever one might think of Reisner's interpretations or misinterpretations of Egyptian and Nubian cultures, his expedition relationship with his Qufti workmen was truly progressive on many levels. He trained the Egyptian teams in the skilled labor positions of the expedition, not simply to act as basket carriers for removing debris. He delegated to them many of the most important aspects of the dig, from excavating fragile objects to keeping accounts, paying the men, and producing the professional documentation photography. But most impressive of all are the Arabic diaries kept by his Egyptian reises. This is the earliest photo I have of the patriarch of this family from el-Qal. And here's another one. He's the shorter one running this race that you see here at Dar el-Balas in the early days, 1900. And I'll show a few photos that have been colorized with artificial intelligence here. I'm aware that the purists find this somewhat perilous thing to do. Nevertheless, I hope it brings some of them to life a little bit. Sayed Ahmed started with Reisner as a small boy back in 1899, just carrying his camera and his notebooks. By 1901, though, Reisner had turned over his darkroom work to Sayed Ahmed, and Sayed learned to process and tone the photo prints. Reisner once proudly wrote that Sayed was, quote, doing the work to which Lithgow and Mace gave over half their time last year and doing it fully as well. This is the first time, I believe, that a felah has been taught to do this work. So by 1905 or 6, Sayed Ahmed had taken over all the photographic responsibilities and even training several Egyptian assistants of his own. And here is an example foreshadowing the art of time-lapse photography, where Reisner sent Sayed Ahmed 1/3 the way up the Pyramid of Menkaure's east face to photograph the daily progress of the work clearing the temple, the Pyramid Temple. Obviously, I'm whipping through this way too fast. Well, at least on my screen. I hope it's going fast on your screens. But you get the idea of being able to track the progress of the expedition's work. In April 1910, after about 1,200 images at many different sites, Sayed Ahmed's assistants took over for him in the photo studio because since 1908, Reisner promoted him to head reis, replacing his brother Mahmoud el-Mayet. We'll meet him in a moment. So here's a quick partial genealogy of the Diraz family, and you can see underlined in red are 4 different reises. Sayed Ahmed is circled here, and he switched off back and forth between his brother, Reis Mahmoud el-Mayet. Mahmoud el-Mayet has a son named Dewey, and then there are 2 sons of Sayed Ahmed as well. We'll see those in a moment. Very important to keep in mind, though, is many of these men were farmed out to other expeditions, not just in Egypt, but in Sudan and also in the Levant. So their influence on ancient Near Eastern archaeology is much broader than anyone knew before. The blue line indicates where the family stopped working in archaeology, but I was very lucky to get to know the 2 names at the bottom of the chart. So these men were so talented, in fact, that Reisner's Western white assistants were often on site primarily just to provide cover, as the white men supposedly running the excavations, but not really. And this is documented with many names of Western assistants to Reisner, many you probably wouldn't even recognize. In April 1912 at Mesheikh, in 1913 at Naga el Hai, 1915 at Deir el-Bersha, and again at the end of that year with Daus Dunham at Gamay, all of these under Said Ahmed's tutelage and others. Daus Dunham once wrote that Said Ahmed would have been quite capable of running the excavation by himself, but as he spoke little English, I went along primarily to keep the records and to be the white man ostensibly in charge. Just a few examples of Sayed's administrative and archaeological prowess. He was, back up a little bit. He was amazing at organizing moving massive stone objects, from colossal statue fragments to stone sarcophagi. A Spelta's sarcophagus weighs about 16 tons, you see in the color photograph here. At Jebel Barkal by the Fourth Cataract, when labor relations with the local populations threatened to collapse and break down because of a kickback scheme that was run by the local Omda, Said Ahmed strategically offered to hire a workforce from another region and bring them back to the table. And at Deir el-Bersha, when some disgruntled local men hid all the expedition's tools down a burial shaft, he was instrumental in getting them back and making things right again. He was held in the highest esteem, and not just at home. He had the largest house in el-Qal, and you see it here being restored. I thank Marlene de Meyer for this photograph from recent years. And many people came to visit him in his home, not just Reisner, but also Daus Dunham, the American painter Joseph Lyndon Smith, and his wife, the Arabist Corinna. Also, MFA director came in 1938 as well, George Harold Edgell. And then after the expedition closed in 1950, even Bernard Boatmer was there for a visit as a young curator at that time at the Museum of Fine Arts on his very first trip to Egypt. Of all of Said Ahmed's many contributions, though, to the success of the expedition, probably the greatest one came in 1925 during the discovery of the tomb of Hetaperes, G7000X at Giza. Alan Rowe and Duncan Greenlees were running the show because Reisner was back at Harvard teaching and at the MFA, and they wanted to dive right in and clear the tomb. It was Said Ahmed who stopped them and cabled Reisner until Reisner could return from Boston and run the show a lot more meticulously and professionally. So Said Ahmed basically saved the tomb of Hetaperes for posterity. Unfortunately, though, in the middle of those excavations, he took ill and died of pneumonia in 1926, and this is a photograph of his grave at Quft. He was replaced by his brother, Mahmoud el-Mayet. That name means the deceased. It refers to a coma that he suffered when he was a youth. He was even pronounced dead and fitted for a coffin before miraculously reviving. But from 1898, he started out his archaeological career as a houseboy and then worked for a bunch of different expeditions, and you can see some of them listed here. In 1917, however, working for the Penn expedition and Clarence Fisher, he got into quite a row, mainly caused by Fisher's paranoia, and this ensuing feud between the Penn expedition and Reisner's Harvard MFA expedition almost tanked both of the expeditions. That's the subject of another story, however. Mahmoud el-Mayet died in 1931, but his legacy lived on in the form of his son, Mahmoud Ahmed Diraz, also called Dewey Mahmoud, and we'll learn about him later. He joined the expedition in 1919 as an assistant to his uncle, Said Ahmed, after training in the Kenna primary school. The next generation, here they are in black and white and colorized. These are two sons of Said Ahmed, Muhammad Said Diraz and his brother Mahmoud Said Diraz. They took over running the show and really ran the expedition for the rest of its run and also the rest of Reisner's life. He died at the pyramids in 1942. Only one of them was actually head reis, that was Muhammad Said. And in addition to handling the men, keeping the Arabic diary, supervising logistics, he kept the expedition running through the difficult years of the Depression, Reisner's death in 1942, and the perils of the Second World War. Muhammad helped outfit air raid shelters out of Giza tombs that they selected, both for Reisner and his Western staff and also for the Egyptian men during all the air raid sirens of the German bombing alarms. And later he also assisted with placing the men in other jobs once it became clear in the 1940s that the expedition was nearing its end. His brother, shown here, Mahmoud, was working most of the time up at Harvard camp west of the pyramids, became fluent in English and Arabic, and he helped out with manuscripts, translations, correspondence, etc. This is a shot from later on in 1954. After the expedition shut down in 47, Mohammed and Mahmoud went on to other jobs, and it's a pity that their descendants went into other fields and the family connection to archaeology effectively stopped. Now let's fast forward a little bit to the present, well, at least to 2005 anyway. For many, many years, I'd wondered if the descendants of the Diraz family of reises might have photographs or stories or documents to share about their talented ancestors and help us out in the history of the expedition. But of course, the question was how to locate them. At that time, Mansour Barek and Mohammed Shiha were inspectors at Giza, and I asked them if they could help, and lo and behold, they were terrific and successful. So in 2005, Mohammed Shiha told me that he'd located one of Reis Mohammed Sayed's sons, who was eager to meet me. And in January 2006, I was welcomed to Mark Lehner's ERA headquarters, for which I thank him. And you see the photo of the four of us meeting there. I made the acquaintance of Hassan Mohammed Sayed Ahmed Diraz, third of 9 sons, 9 children of Reis Mohammed Sayed Diraz. Hag Hassan was born in 1938. He remembered Reisner since he'd lived up at Harvard camp for 10 years as a child with his family. He was 5 years old when Reisner died. Instead of a career in archaeology, though, Hag Hassan was, prior to his retirement, a communications engineer, and he'd worked for the Ericsson Telecom Company and the governments of Kuwait and Egypt. And he brought this book to show me. I was stunned. It was a Nubian expedition diary. And lo and behold, there were more of them. About 74 books from all different sites, as a matter of fact, all stored for all of these years up at el-Qal in the family home. I met his family. I met his mother. She's labeled in red there, the widow of Mohammed Sayed, the former Reis. I met his older brother Saad, and I never expected to meet him because I'd read in the records how in 1943, as a boy at Giza, he found a shiny object near the Khafre pyramid, took it to the Eastern Cemetery, where you see him in the photo at the lower right there, and they all started banging on it. And of course, it was a hand grenade and exploded, and he lost an eye and the use of one arm, but nevertheless went on to a successful career. So I was delighted to meet him too. We had a wonderful time wandering through Giza and the Western Cemetery. This is Hassan Diraz pointing out the air raid shelter that he used. That's tomb NC2, or the Cave of the Birds, that was in the press a few years ago. And off in the distance there is the site where the Grand Egyptian Museum is now located. This is just a partial inventory list of all of the diary books. You can see in the right-hand column a lot of the sites, the years, the page numbers. They all run about 100 pages each, and it's really quite a treasure trove. So with Zahi Hawas's approval, back then we retrieved the diaries. We shipped them to Boston. It was a whopping FedEx bill. And the funding to purchase and ship them was generously provided by William Kelly Simpson and David Pendlebury. We started scanning the Giza books from all of them, about 40 books out of 74, the Giza books at the MFA as part of the Giza project. And we finished that up about 2007 or so. It's still a mystery why these Arabic diary books remained in Egypt all these years and didn't come home with Dowse Dunham and William Stevenson Smith when they packed up Harvard camp for good in 1947. At that point, I hired Dr. Ramadan Hussein, who was then a graduate student at Brown University, to translate the 40 Giza volumes that we'd scanned over many years in between his other work. We miss Ramadan terribly. I know many of you do as well, and I'd like to dedicate this project to his memory. And he was an excellent choice for translating as well, because obviously being an Egyptologist for one, an archaeologist, but he had digging experience at Giza itself, and as a scholar, he was familiar with the Upper Egyptian terminology that was used by the Quftis in these diaries. After translation, the Giza project staff, primarily Rachel Aronin, along with Nick Picardo and Jeremy Casala, supervised Harvard PhD students such as Kate Rose, and we began to parse out the text on the pages for database linking by tomb number, by object, by personal name, etc., to the various records in our Giza database and website, and that work is ongoing. This is an absolutely unique body of archaeological literature from early 20th century Egyptian archaeology. The books include details that are often missing from their English language counterparts as well, so they're extra special. Here are just a few samples to show you. Here are some that show sketches and plans and sections of Giza tomb shafts. And on the right-hand column, you see the Arabic diary translation, and I'm underlining in red a lot of the extra stuff. So often the men who are actually working in specific shafts are named when they're not in the English versions. Extra details are in there as well. Here is one from the time when Dewey Mahmoud, the son of Mahmoud al-Mayet, was keeping the diaries. And in 1936, Reisner's attention was drawn to this reused block, which has the Abutiyu dog stealer text, where the king is ordering a burial for his favorite dog. And Dewey has actually copied the hieroglyphs in the Arabic diary here. Another one shows an excellent plan of this tomb 2420 in the Western Cemetery, where all of these Serdab statues turned up. And then also what we so rarely see in the literature, but now we can fill in some of these gaps, is the archaeological interpretation and speculation by the reises. Here is one about reserve heads, where Syed Ahmed is writing, and it's in 1913. He says, "We think that the heads must have been originally buried in the burial chamber, behind the blocking stones. We think that whoever broke into the blocking stones tossed them outside of the burial chamber, then entered the burial chamber and destroyed the coffins and tossed them out, just as they did with the heads. The evidence for that is that the heads, the coffin fragments, and the debris of the burial chamber are found right in front of the blocking stones. We think that the heads must have been on top of a coffin or sarcophagus. When the ancient tomb robbers opened the coffins, they tossed the heads out because they were looking for gold. But when they did not find gold, they destroyed the coffins and tossed the heads outside the burial chamber. This is what I think." And then 2 months later, he wrote a letter to Reisner, who had just left Giza for the south, and he says, "I just realized that the shafts we excavated after your departure to Kerma do not have reserve heads, nor do the 2 shafts we dug when you were still at the pyramids. I think the reason for that is that there are no sarcophagi of white limestone in these shafts. We found reserve heads in all the shafts with a limestone sarcophagus or fragments of a sarcophagus. So, the shaft that does not have a limestone sarcophagus does not have a reserve head either. This is what I think. Only God knows." The Arabic diary for 1915 reveals the reises' analysis of the deterioration process of the mud brick chapel walls outside the limestone mastabah's entrance. And this comment shows an appreciation for the stratigraphy, even more welcome since the chapel is all but invisible today, as you can see from the modern color photo down below. He says these 2 chambers are part of the chapel of 4710. It seems that the walls and ceilings of these chambers caved in because the walls are collapsed in big chunks, which still have plaster on them. What also corroborates this assumption is that the shaft of Mastabah 4710 is filled with limestone chips with no sand. So there's also local color in these books that we don't get anywhere else. Just a couple of samples here, some of them tragic. There are people named who had accidents and lost consciousness. Photo setups were ruined the next day because the dough that was used to position objects was eaten by rats at Harvard camp. Other inexperienced men pushed the de Cauville cars too far and off the tracks and ended up dying of head wounds. The wind ripped the roof off of Reisner's office in 1933. Muhammad Ani Ibrahim, who took so many of the photographs over a long career, broke some glass negatives and yet rephotographed a skeleton still in position 2 years later, and on and on. Limestone blocks dropped on the feet of some of the workmen, unfortunately. There's documentation about thefts at Giza, sometimes inside jobs, and even the hiring of sniffer dogs to run to the local village and find out who did the dirty deed. Some people fell down burial shafts, even dying. In other cases, people were thrown down burial shafts, even by their relatives. And there's documentation of Joseph Lyndon Smith's paintings exhibitions every year up at Harvard camp, recording, for example, 280 guests and 113 cars, and a list of VIPs. So we're starting a new project now to focus beyond just the Giza diaries and hoping to take all of them in toto. And some of our goals are trying to learn what the best practices will be in researching, translating, and parsing the rest of the texts, studying how many different hands are actually involved, the difference between writing on their own and scribal dictation, things like that. Social network analysis, can we create charts and graphs and link people and frequencies and different expedition members and guests and visitors and who's present where when what discoveries were made. Questions of literacy among the Egyptian staff. And of course, the relationships between the Reis family, the Qft workmen, networks, and the local expedition hires, not just in Egypt, but in the Sudan as well, and also the relationships with Western archaeological employers, of course, like Reisner and the rest of the Western staff, and the political context as well, the British occupation and the French Antiquities Service control. And finally, how best to put all this together and disseminate the results. So we're working with our MFA colleagues, and I thank Larry Berman and Denise Doxey, and we're hoping to get this project underway. In the meantime, if you want to learn more about these characters, here is a shameless plug for an attempt to describe Reisner's career and the development of Egyptian archaeology, coming, I hope, this fall. And all of these Reis families and others are mentioned there in more detail. So the Arabic diaries illuminate all kinds of aspects of the Harvard MFA expedition, from the discoveries to the processing and documentation at Harvard camp, which you see here in this simulation, to the labor relations between Egyptians and Western archaeologists. They illuminate how these men fanned out and worked at other expeditions as well, and had a tremendous influence originating from Reisner on so much archaeology in Egypt, the Sudan, and the Levant and the rest of the ancient Near East. So with luck, we hope in future to give voices to those who have remained voiceless for so long. And it remains to thank the many, many people who've made this discovery possible and are still making possible what I hope will be lots of great research and great work in the future. But perhaps above all, we owe Hassan Diraz and his illustrious Qft family a great debt, not just for his professionalism in preserving the diary books over so many decades, but also for his deep knowledge of family history, his willingness to share it, and his hospitality in Cairo. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Manwelian. We have a few minutes for questions. If any of our attendees would like to post a question, please use the Q&A box below. Oh, me too. We have a question.
What kinds of other languages are in the diaries? Well, it's all Arabic, but different handwriting, and so that's going to give us some clues as well. But there are English language diaries kept by some of Reisner's staff. But by the time you get to the later years of the expedition, the 1930s, for example, the diaries are only being kept in Arabic by the Egyptian reises. What about dialects? Well, they're mostly Upper Egyptian dialects, so we have a lot of language study to do. And thanks to Marlene de Meyer and Wendy Doyon and hopefully Nisha Kumar at Harvard, we hope to form a team that's going to analyze some of that language as well. That's part of the goal of the project. Tell us more about the new book. Well, you can look on Amazon for Walking Among Pharaohs, and it's a biography, but it tries to go beyond just Reisner's life and talk about the expedition and the development of Egyptian archaeology in general. Did other expeditions keep an Arabic diary? Here and there, but as far as I know, this is absolutely the only example of diaries over decades and decades. Thanks very much.